Imagine spending 2 years watching your wife cheat on you with your worst enemy and never saying a word. Not because you are weak, but because you are waiting for the perfect moment to destroy them both legally, financially, and publicly. Brandon Keaton is a genius architect who treats betrayal like a structural flaw in a building. You don't scream at it. You schedule a controlled demolition. When his wife, Elise, tried to humiliate him on live TV to steal his fortune, she didn't realize she had already signed her own confession. From pouring red wine on $1 million painting to revealing the toxic mud beneath a skyscraper, this story proves that the scariest person in the room is the one who is listening. Watch until the end to see exactly how a billion-dollar empire of lies crumbles in seconds. The rain over London was not merely a weather event that evening. It was a mood, a heavy, gray curtain draped over the city's skeletal skyline, blurring the lights of the Thames into smeared watercolors. Inside the penthouse atrium of the Keaton Spire, however, the storm was nothing more than a silent visual effect, separated from the guests by 3 inches of reinforced acoustic glass. The spire was Brandon Keaton's magnum opus, a 100-story needle of steel and ambition that pierced the clouds, designed to look as though it were defying gravity itself. It was the tallest residential building in Western Europe, a testament to order, structure, and the cold, unyielding perfection that Brandon had dedicated his life to achieving. Brandon stood near the edge of the floor-to-ceiling window, a solitary figure in a tuxedo that had been tailored to his frame with surgical precision. He held a glass of mineral water, his knuckles pale against the crystal. He did not drink. He simply watched the reflection of the room behind him. The elite of London society were there, aristocrats with fading fortunes, tech moguls in sneakers worth more than cars, and the sharks of the real estate world who had come hoping to see flaws in Brandon's armor. The air smelled of expensive perfume, truffle oil, and the metallic tang of envy. To anyone looking at him, Brandon Keaton was the master of his universe, a man who had reshaped the London horizon. But Brandon was not looking at the skyline. He was watching his wife, Elise Harrington. She was circulating through the crowd like a drop of blood in a glass of milk, wearing a gown of deep crimson velvet that hugged her curves and trailed behind her like a royal decree. Diamonds, gifts from Brandon for their various anniversaries, glittered at her throat and ears, cold stones warming themselves against her skin. She was laughing, tilting her head back in that practiced, elegant way that made every man in the room feel as though he were the only person she saw. She was the curator of the Harrington Gallery, a woman of exquisite taste, the perfect soft counterpoint to Brandon's hard edges. Or at least, that was the role she had played for 5 years. Tonight, however, Brandon noticed the tremor in her hand when she reached for a champagne flute. He noticed the way her eyes darted toward the shadows near the service entrance, where Mason Drake was leaning against a pillar, swirling a glass of scotch. Mason Drake was everything Brandon was not. Where Brandon was discipline and silence, Mason was chaos and noise. Mason was a developer who cut corners, a man who plastered gold leaf over rotting wood and called it luxury. He had been Brandon's rival for a decade, always finishing second, always bitter. Seeing Mason here, at the launch of Brandon's greatest triumph, should have been an annoyance. But seeing the subtle, almost imperceptible nod Mason gave to Elise sent a different sensation through Brandon's chest. Not anger, but a hollow, icy confirmation. The blueprint was final. The demolition was scheduled. The room grew quiet as the lights dimmed, leaving only the spotlights trained on the small stage at the center of the atrium. The chatter died down, replaced by the polite rustle of silk and the clinking of glasses being set down. It was time for the speeches. Usually, Brandon would speak first, thanking the engineers and the city council, but tonight, the program had been changed at the last minute. Elise had insisted she wanted to introduce him. She wanted to pay tribute to her husband. Elise walked up the steps to the stage, the spotlight catching the tears that were already welling in her large, expressive eyes. She looked devastatingly beautiful and heartbreakingly fragile. She gripped the microphone stand with both hands, as if she needed it to stay upright. The silence in the room became heavy, thick with anticipation. "Distinguished guests, friends," Elise began, her voice trembling just enough to evoke instant sympathy. "We are here to celebrate a building, a magnificent, towering achievement of engineering. The Keaton Spire. It is perfect. It is flawless. It is cold." A ripple of confusion went through the crowd. Brandon did not move. He remained by the window, his face a mask of stone, his eyes fixed on the back of her head. He knew every line of this script. He had seen it written in the secret bank transfers and the late-night absences for the past 2 years. Elise took a deep breath, and a single tear tracked perfectly down her cheek. "For 5 years, I have lived in the shadow of Brandon's genius. I have tried to be the wife he needed. I have tried to bring warmth into a world made of steel and glass. But I have failed. Tonight, looking at this tower, I realize that it is a monument to the man I married. It is beautiful, yes, but it is empty. There is no heart here. There is no love here." The shock in the room was palpable. Guests exchanged wide-eyed glances. Whispers began to hiss like steam escaping a valve. This was not a toast. It was an execution. "I cannot do it anymore," Elise sobbed, her voice breaking with theatrical perfection. "I cannot live with a man who loves concrete more than he loves his wife. I cannot be a trophy in his collection, dusted off for galas and put back on the shelf when the work begins. I am lonely. God, I am so lonely in this golden cage." She looked up, her eyes finding the camera lenses that were broadcasting the event to the business channels. "Brandon," she said, turning to face him across the room, "you are a brilliant architect. You can build anything, but you do not know how to build a home. You do not know how to love." The accusation hung in the air, violent and absolute. Brandon felt the collective gaze of 500 people bore into him. They looked at him with a mixture of pity and disgust. The billionaire genius, the king of London real estate, publicly castrated by the weeping woman in red. They saw a monster. They saw a cold, unfeeling robot who had neglected his beautiful, spirited wife. Then, the final blow came. From the shadows, Mason Drake stepped forward. He did not run. He walked with the confident stride of a savior. He climbed the stairs to the stage and wrapped a protective arm around Elise's shoulders. She collapsed into him, burying her face in his chest, sobbing uncontrollably. Mason looked out at the crowd, his expression grave, acting the part of the concerned friend who could no longer stand by and watch such injustice. "It is all right, Elise," Mason said, his voice booming slightly without the microphone, deep and reassuring. "You are safe now. I will take you away from here. You do not have to spend another night in the cold." Mason's eyes locked with Brandon's across the room. For a brief second, the mask slipped, and Brandon saw the smirk of triumph. It was a look that said, "I have taken your reputation. I have taken your wife. And soon, I will take your city." The flashbulbs erupted like lightning. The cameras captured the image that would be on every tabloid cover by morning. The crying wife, the heroic rival, and the stoic, heartless husband standing alone in the distance. Brandon did not storm the stage. He did not shout. He did not defend himself. He simply set his glass of water down on a passing waiter's tray. His face remained completely impassive, devoid of shock or hurt. It was the face of a man watching a building collapse exactly as he had calculated it would. He watched as Mason guided Elise down the stairs, parting the sea of stunned guests, leading her toward the exit as if they were royalty fleeing a burning castle. The room was buzzing with scandal. People were already pulling out their phones, tweeting, texting, spreading the poison. Brandon stood alone in the center of his greatest creation, isolated by a circle of judgment. He turned back to the window. The rain was raining harder now, lashing against the glass. Below him, London was a sprawling grid of lights and shadows. He placed a hand against the cold glass. They thought he was broken. They thought he was humiliated. They did not understand that an architect inspects the foundation before he condemns the structure. He had let them have their performance. He had let them believe they had won the first act. "Enjoy the applause, Elise," Brandon whispered to his reflection, his voice so low it was swallowed by the silence of the room. "Because the curtain is about to fall, and you have no idea who wrote the play. He turned away from the window and walked toward the private elevator, his back straight, his stride steady. The guests parted for him, not out of respect, but out of fear of his coldness. He did not look at any of them. The bronze doors of the private elevator slid open with a hushed whisper, revealing the sanctuary of the penthouse that crowned the Keaton spire. The air inside was cool, filtered to a level of purity that felt almost sterile, carrying the faint, crisp scent of white tea and cedar. Brandon Keaton stepped out of the elevator and into the vast, open expanse of his living quarters. The silence here was absolute, a heavy velvet blanket that smothered the memory of the chaotic gala 100 floors below. He loosened the silk bow tie at his throat, pulling it free and letting it hang loose around his collar, the first sign of disarray he had allowed himself all evening. He walked across the polished marble floor, the sound of his dress, shoes echoing sharply in the emptiness. To an outsider, this apartment might have seemed like a museum or a mausoleum. There were no family photographs on the mantel, no cluttered piles of magazines, no stray coats thrown over the back of a sofa. Everything was white, gray, or black, arranged with mathematical precision. Elise had hated this space. She had called it an operating theater, devoid of soul. She had begged to fill it with colorful abstract paintings and plush velvet furniture, but Brandon had refused. He needed clarity. He needed a space where his mind could construct complex geometries without the interference of visual noise. Now, in the absence of her perfume and her constant, nervous energy, the apartment finally felt like his again. Brandon approached the wall of glass that faced the River Thames. The rain was intensifying, hammering against the reinforced panes with a rhythmic violence that distorted the city lights into long, weeping streaks of neon and amber. London lay beneath him, a sprawling, breathing organism of stone and history. From this height, the cars were nothing more than blood cells moving through the arteries of the metropolis, and the people were invisible. It was a perspective that usually brought him peace, the godlike detachment of the architect looking down upon the grid. Tonight, however, the city felt different. It felt like an audience waiting for the second act. He reached into the pocket of his tuxedo jacket and retrieved his phone. The screen illuminated his face in the darkness. He did not need to search for the news. It was already trending on every major platform. The headlines screamed in bold, accusatory fonts. The Ice King melts. Elise Harrington escapes golden cage. Mason Drake, the knight in shining armor. He swiped through the photographs. There was Elise, her face buried in Mason's shoulder, looking small and defenseless. There was Mason, jaw set in righteous anger, guiding her into a waiting limousine. And then there was Brandon. The photographers had captured him standing alone at the window, his back to the room. The caption read, "The lonely tycoon watches his world crumble." Brandon placed the phone face down on the black granite kitchen island. A ghost of a smile touched his lips, cold and humorless. The narrative was perfect. It was exactly what the public wanted. They loved to see the fall of a titan. They loved to believe that money could not buy happiness, that the genius in the ivory tower was miserable and unloved. It validated their own lives. Elise and Mason had played their roles beautifully. Following the script, Brandon had silently encouraged them to write for themselves over the last 24 months. They thought they had humiliated him. They thought they had stripped him bare before the world. He walked over to the wet bar, but instead of reaching for the crystal decanter of scotch that Elise always kept stocked for Mason's secret visits, Brandon opened a bottle of sparkling water. He poured it into a glass, listening to the fizz of the carbonation, the only sound in the room. He took a slow, deliberate sip. The water was cold and sharp. Clarity. That was what he needed now. Not the numbness of alcohol, but the razor-sharp edge of total sobriety. He moved toward his study, a room that was the true heart of the penthouse. The walls here were lined with architectural reference books and framed sketches of his earliest buildings. In the center of the room stood a large drafting table, illuminated by a single, focused architectural lamp. But tonight, the table was not covered with blueprints for a skyscraper or a museum. It was covered with a different kind of architecture. Brandon sat down in his leather chair and unlocked the top drawer of his desk. He pulled out a thick, leather-bound dossier. It was heavy, dense with paper. He laid it on the table and opened it with the care one might use to handle a rare manuscript. Inside were not drawings of steel beams or load-bearing walls, but financial schematics. These were the blueprints of Mason Drake's life. For 2 years, ever since the night he had first smelled Mason's cologne on Elise's scarf, Brandon had not screamed. He had not thrown a vase against the wall. He had done what he did best. He had investigated the structure. He had hired forensic accountants instead of divorce lawyers. He had bought information instead of sympathy. His finger traced a line on a spreadsheet. Mason Drake was not the wealthy tycoon he pretended to be. He was a master of leverage, a magician juggling loans to pay off other loans. The empire Mason had built was a house of cards, held together by fraud, inflated asset valuations, and risky gambling with investor money. And lately, that money had been coming from the Harrington Arts Foundation, Elise's charity. Brandon turned the page. There were copies of bank transfers, authorized by Elise, moving millions of pounds from the charity mint for struggling young artists into offshore shell companies controlled by Mason. She thought she was investing with her lover, helping him through a temporary cash flow problem. She did not realize she was financing a sinking ship. She did not realize that Mason was not saving her. He was using her as a life raft. Structural failure imminent, Brandon murmured to the empty room. He looked at the photos of them partying tonight. They were likely at the Box or some other exclusive club, celebrating their victory, drinking champagne that cost more than most people earned in a month, toasting to their freedom and their future. They believed they had won. They believed Brandon was up here in his tower, crying, broken, perhaps calling his lawyers in a panic to salvage his reputation. They did not know that Brandon had already bought the debt on Mason's flagship project, the Riverfront Plaza. They did not know that Brandon was the silent partner in the holding company that owned the lease on Elise's favorite gallery. They did not know that the humiliation tonight was the final variable Brandon had needed to trigger the collapse. By publicly leaving him, Elise had violated the morality clause in their prenuptial agreement. But more importantly, she had tied her public image irrevocably to Mason. Now, when Mason went down, he would take her down with him. There would be no distance between them. They were cemented together. Brandon closed the dossier. The sound was a soft, final thud in the quiet room. He stood up and walked back to the window. The rain had turned into a deluge, washing the city clean. He felt a profound sense of relief. The waiting was the hardest part of any construction project. The months of planning, of securing permits, of digging the foundation, it was tedious. But now, the demolition charges were set. The detonator was in his hand. He looked at his reflection in the glass. The man staring back was not a victim. He was a predator who had simply waited for the prey to wander into the trap. The public humiliation was a small price to pay for the total annihilation that was to follow. Let them have their headlines for one night. Let them laugh. Tomorrow, Brandon whispered, his eyes cold and hard as diamonds. Tomorrow, the ground begins to shake. He turned off the lamp, plunging the room into darkness, save for the ambient glow of the city he practically owned. He did not go to the bedroom he had shared with Elise. Instead, he lay down on the leather sofa in his study, listening to the rain, his mind already calculating the angles of the debris field. He slept the sleep of the just, dreamless and deep, while across the city, his wife danced on the edge of a precipice she could not even see. The morning sun over London broke through the clouds with a brilliance that felt almost complicit, casting a sharp, unforgiving light on the city streets that were still slick from the previous night's storm. In the private dining room of the Wolseley, one of Piccadilly's most prestigious establishments, the mood was not one of penitence, but of coronation. Elise Harrington sat by the window, her sunglasses pushed up into her hair, reading the front page of the Daily Mail. The headline was bold and brutal. The cold architect crumbles. Wife leaves Brandon Keaton for rival. She felt a rush of adrenaline, a heady cocktail of vindication and freedom. For years, she had felt like an ornament in Brandon's life, a beautiful vase placed in a corner of a silent room. Now, she was the protagonist. The world was talking about her pain, her bravery, her escape. Across the table, Mason Drake was attacking a plate of eggs Benedict with the gusto of a man who believed he had just inherited the earth. He looked vibrant, his skin flushed with success, a stark contrast to Brandon's pale, marble-like composure. Mason was alive, chaotic, and loud. "They are eating it up, Elise," Mason said, gesturing with his fork toward the stack of newspapers. "Look at the stock market. Keaton's shares dipped 3% this morning. Investors hate instability. They hate a leader who can't even manage his own household." Elise smiled, though a tiny, nearly invisible knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. "I didn't do it to hurt his stock price, Mason. I did it because I was suffocating." "Of course, darling," Mason replied smoothly, reaching across the white tablecloth to cover her hand with his. His palm was warm, perhaps a little too damp. But in this world, love and war are the same thing. You hurt him, and now we win. With his reputation in the mud, the city council will be looking for a new golden boy. And they're looking at me. He pulled his hand back to check his phone, his eyes lighting up as he scrolled through emails. Mason was currently breaking ground on his own ambitious project, the Aurora, a luxury residential complex on the banks of the Thames, situated on a prime plot of land in the Docklands. It was meant to be his answer to the Keaton Spire, flashier, trendier, and built in half the time. It was the project that would catapult him from a second-tier developer to a true titan. And, crucially, it was the project Elise had secretly helped capitalize, funneling millions from her art foundation's endowment investments into Mason's holding companies. "Speaking of winning," Mason said, wiping his mouth with a linen napkin, "I'm heading to the site. The piling rigs started this morning. We're going to build the Aurora so fast Brandon's head will spin. He spends years studying wind patterns. I build what people want to buy. That's the difference." Elise watched him go, sipping her mimosa. She told herself she was happy. She told herself this was what passion looked like. But as the waiter refilled her glass, she couldn't help but remember the way Brandon worked. Brandon never bragged about speed. He spoke of integrity and legacy. He would spend weeks just analyzing the soil composition before a single shovel touched the earth. Mason, by contrast, treated construction like a sprint. She pushed the thought away. Brandon was the past. Mason was the future. 2 hours later, the atmosphere at the construction site in the Docklands was far less celebratory. The air smelled of diesel fumes and wet, brackish river mud. Mason stepped out of his Bentley, his Italian leather shoes immediately sinking into the soft, gray sludge that coated the ground. He frowned, looking at the chaotic scene before him. The massive piling rigs, which should have been hammering concrete supports deep into the bedrock, were silent. A man in a high-visibility vest and a white hard hat approached him. It was O'Malley, the site foreman, a man with a face weathered by decades of London winters. He did not look happy. "Why have the machines stopped?" Mason demanded, sidestepping a puddle. "Time is money, O'Malley. I want the foundation poured by next month." O'Malley took off his hard hat and rubbed his bald head, a gesture of profound frustration. "We've hit a snag, Mr. Drake. A big one." "There are no snags," Mason snapped. "Only solutions." "What is it? A pipe? An old Roman ruin? Just pay someone off and keep drilling." "It's the ground, sir," O'Malley said, his voice grave. "We started driving the test piles, and they're just vanishing. The geological survey said we'd hit bedrock at 20 meters. We're down to 40, and it's still soup. It's like building on pudding." Mason felt a cold prickle of sweat on the back of his neck. "That's impossible. I saw the survey myself. The land was certified for high-rise development. I bought it from that holding company, Orion Properties." "Well, whoever Orion is, they sold you a lemon," O'Malley spat, gesturing to the gray expanse of mud. "This used to be an industrial dumping ground in the 50s. The soil is unstable. If we build on this without specialized reinforcement, the whole thing will tilt within a year. Like the Leaning Tower of Pisa, but without the charm." Mason stared at the mud. The land had been a steal. It had been too good to be true. A prime riverside location listed quietly by an anonymous seller just when Mason was desperate for a flagship location. He had snatched it up, bypassing his usual due diligence to close the deal before anyone else could. Fix it, Mason hissed. It's not that simple, O'Malley replied. To stabilize this, we need to bring in deep soil mixing rigs. We need to inject concrete into the soil itself before we can even think about the foundation. It's going to take months, Mr. Drake. And the cost? How much? Conservative estimate? Another £4 million. Maybe 5. The number hit Mason like a physical blow. 5 million. He didn't have 5 million liquid. He was leveraged to the hilt. Every asset he owned was collateral for another loan. The only liquid cash he had access to was. He thought of Elise. He thought of the Harrington Arts Foundation. Do it, Mason said, his voice tight. Just get it done. Don't tell the investors. Don't tell the press. If word gets out that the Aurora is sinking before it's even built, we're dead. I can't start without a deposit for the specialty contractors, O'Malley warned. You'll have it by Monday, Mason lied, turning on his heel and marching back to his car. He slammed the door of the Bentley, sealing himself in the quiet luxury of the interior, but his hands were shaking. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white. This was a disaster. A £5 million hole in the ground. How could the survey have been so wrong? Unbeknownst to Mason, across the city, inside the cool, silent study of the penthouse, Brandon Keaton was looking at the very same geological survey. But Brandon's copy was the original, unredacted version from 10 years ago. He knew exactly what was under that land in the docklands. He knew about the industrial sludge and the false bedrock. He had created Orion Properties specifically to hold that toxic asset, waiting for the day he could sell it to a competitor whose ambition outweighed his intelligence. Brandon didn't need to be at the construction site to know what was happening. He could picture the mud. He could imagine the panic rising in Mason's chest. Back in the Bentley, Mason pulled out his phone and dialed Elise. His voice changed instantly, shifting from the panic of a desperate businessman to the smooth, seductive tone of a lover. Elise, darling, Mason said, forcing a smile onto his face as he watched the rain start to fall on his muddy construction site. Change of plans for dinner. I was thinking we should discuss the future. There's an opportunity, a chance to expand the foundation's portfolio even more. It's urgent, and I want you to be the first to benefit from it. He hung up, the lie tasting like ash in his mouth. The first crack had appeared in the facade. It wasn't a crack in the concrete of his building. It was a crack in the illusion he had sold to Elise. He needed her money, again. And this time, it wouldn't be an investment. It would be a salvage operation. The rain began to drum on the roof of the car, a slow, rhythmic tapping that sounded suspiciously like a clock ticking down. Mason put the car in gear and drove away from the mud, leaving the problem behind him, unaware that he was not driving away from the trap, but deeper into it. The memory did not return to Brandon as a flood of emotion, but rather as a precise, high-definition architectural rendering, sharp and unyielding. It was exactly 2 years ago, a Tuesday in November, the kind of London evening where the fog rolled off the Thames and swallowed the streets whole. The city had felt muted, dampened by the weather, and Brandon had left his firm early, a rare occurrence driven by a simple, foolish impulse. He wanted to surprise his wife. Elise had been working late at the Harrington Gallery for weeks, citing an upcoming exhibition of avant-garde modernism that required her absolute attention. Brandon had driven himself to the gallery in Mayfair, a bouquet of white peonies, her favorite, resting on the passenger seat of his Aston Martin. He remembered the weight of the heavy oak doors as he pushed them open. The chime above the entrance turned off for the night. The gallery was dim, illuminated only by the track lighting that focused on the canvases, leaving the rest of the space in elegant shadow. It smelled of turpentine, expensive espresso, and the lingering, sweet scent of lilies. He had walked softly, his footsteps absorbed by the plush gray carpeting. He intended to creep up behind her in her office, to wrap his arms around her waist, and take her to dinner. But as he passed the main exhibition hall, something caught his eye. It was a painting hanging in the place of honor, a sprawling, chaotic mess of angry red and black slashes on a canvas. The placard next to it read, Urban Decay by unknown artist. Sold, £150,000. Brandon paused. He knew art. He understood the market. He knew that Elise had an impeccable eye for talent, a refined taste that leaned toward the subtle and the sublime. This painting was neither. It was amateurish, derivative, and aggressive. But what disturbed him was not the aesthetics, it was the price tag. £150,000 for a piece by an unknown artist? It was a valuation that defied logic. It was an anomaly in the structure. He walked past the painting toward Elise's office at the back of the gallery. The door was ajar, spilling a slice of golden light across the dark floor. He heard voices. It is done, Mason. The transfer cleared this morning. The voice was Elise's. It was not the soft, melodic tone she used with Brandon. It was sharper, more conspiratorial, laced with a thrill that sounded dangerously like arousal. Brandon stopped. He stood in the shadows of the corridor, the peonies heavy in his hand. You are a genius, babe, a man's voice replied. It was deep, smooth, and sickeningly familiar. Mason Drake. That money covers the interest on the Docklands loan for another 3 months. You saved my neck. I did not do it for your neck. Elise purred, the sound of ice clinking against glass following her words. I did it because I am bored, Mason. God, I am so bored. Do you know what Brandon got me for our anniversary? A first edition book on brutalist architecture. He thought it was romantic. He thinks concrete is romantic. Laughter followed. It was a cruel, shared sound that echoed off the high ceilings of the gallery. It was the sound of 2 people stripping someone naked without them knowing. He is useful though, Mason said. We cannot kill the golden goose just yet. Once the Aurora is built, once I have the capital to stand on my own, then you can leave him. Then we can take half of his empire and build something real. I hate touching him, Elise whispered, and her voice dropped so low Brandon had to strain to hear it, though he wished he had not. He feels like marble. Cold. Hard. When he looks at me, I feel like he is inspecting a crack in the wall. With you, it's different. It's messy. It's real. Brandon stood there, motionless. In that moment, a lesser man might have stormed into the room. A passionate man might have thrown the flowers, shouted, thrown a punch. But Brandon Keaton was an architect. When an architect discovers a fatal flaw in the foundation of a building, a fracture in the load-bearing pillar that cannot be repaired, he does not scream at the concrete. He accepts the physics of the situation. He acknowledges that the structure is compromised. He begins to plan the demolition. He looked down at the white peonies. They looked ridiculous now. Naive. He carefully placed them on a pedestal next to a bronze sculpture, leaving them there like a funeral offering. He did not leave immediately. He moved closer to the gap in the door, just enough to see them. Elise was sitting on the edge of her mahogany desk, her legs crossed, a glass of wine in her hand. Mason was standing between her knees, his hands resting possessively on her hips. They looked comfortable. They looked like a couple that had existed for a long time. This was not a drunken mistake. This was a lifestyle. Brandon watched them for a full minute. He memorized the scene. He cataloged the way Elise looked at Mason, with a hunger she had never shown him. He noted the way Mason looked at the office, not with love for Elise, but with the greedy calculation of a man assessing the value of the furniture. Then, Brandon turned around. He walked back through the gallery, past the terrible, overpriced painting. He understood now. The painting was a vehicle. Mason was buying art from Elise using shell companies, inflating the value to move money around, likely washing funds from his failing construction projects or hiding assets. Elise was using the gallery to prop up Mason's business, using Brandon's reputation and connections to legitimize the fraud. He stepped out into the cold London night. The fog had thickened, obscuring the streetlights. He got into his car and sat there in the silence. He did not cry. He felt a strange, terrifying calm settle over him. The pain was there, a dull, throbbing ache in the center of his chest, but his mind was already racing ahead, constructing a new reality. If he divorced her now, she would play the victim. She would claim half his fortune. Mason would use the publicity to boost his own profile. They would win. No, Brandon said aloud to the empty car. That is not the design. He started the engine. The engine purred with a deep, restrained power. He would not destroy them today. He would not destroy them tomorrow. He would wait. He would let them build their tower of lies higher and higher. He would let them feel safe. He would let Mason overextend himself until the debt was a noose around his neck. He would let Elise commit more crimes, leave more paper trails, sign more fraudulent documents. He would be the ground beneath their feet, silent and supportive, until the moment they were heavy enough to sink. He drove home that night and walked into the bedroom where Elise would return hours later, smelling of wine and Mason's cologne. He lay in bed and waited. When she finally slid in beside him, feigning sleep, he did not pull away. He lay still, breathing evenly, his heart rate controlled. "Good night, Elise," he had whispered into the dark. She did not answer, thinking he was asleep. That was the night the husband died, and the architect took full control. That was the night he began to draw the blueprints for their ruin. He had spent the last 2 years perfecting every angle, calculating every stress point. And now, back in the present, as the rain washed over London and Mason Drake panicked over a mud pit in the Docklands, Brandon knew that the foundation had finally given way. The silence that followed the scandal was not the peaceful silence of a library, but the suffocating, pressurized silence of a submarine diving too deep. A week had passed since the gala at the Keaton Spire, and while the tabloids were still feasting on the carcass of Brandon Keaton's marriage, the reality of daily life had begun to set in for Elise Harrington. She was currently standing in the VIP suite of a boutique on Bond Street, surrounded by the scent of orchid and new leather. She had come here to buy a watch, a Patek Philippe for Mason, a gift to celebrate the groundbreaking of his new tower, the Aurora. It was a gesture of devotion, but also a gesture of reassurance to herself. If she could buy a £50,000 watch without blinking, then she was not a fallen woman. She was an heiress to a new life. Elise handed the black Centurion card to the sales associate, a young woman with impeccable posture and a smile that did not quite reach her eyes. Elise knew that look. It was the look of someone who read the gossip columns. It was a look that said, "I know who you are, and I know what you did." Elise lifted her chin, staring at her own reflection in the gilt-edged mirror. She looked tired. The thrill of the rebellion was fading, replaced by a low-level anxiety that hummed in her blood like a fluorescent light. "I am afraid there is a problem, Mrs. Keaton," the sales associate said softly. The use of her married name felt like a slap. "It is Ms. Harrington," Elise corrected sharply. "And what could possibly be the problem? Run it again." "I have run it 3 times, madam. It has been declined. The issuer indicates that the account has been frozen due to irregular activity." The room seemed to tilt on its axis. Elise stared at the small plastic rectangle in the woman's hand. It was the card Brandon had given her on their first anniversary. It had no limit. It was the magic wand that had smoothed every edge of her life for 5 years. Frozen. The word tasted metallic. "That is ridiculous," Elise hissed, snatching the card back. Her hands were trembling. "It must be a clerical error. I will sort it out." She walked out of the boutique, the bag of her old life feeling suddenly very light, while the weight of humiliation pressed down on her shoulders. She stepped onto the pavement of Bond Street, where the gray London sky threatened rain yet again. She pulled out her phone to call the bank, but stopped. The account was in Brandon's name. Of course it was. Everything was. The house, the cars, the gallery lease, the insurance. She had walked away from the architect, assuming the building would keep standing. She had not realized he was the ground itself. She hailed a taxi, giving the driver the address of Mason's apartment in Knightsbridge. She needed Mason. She needed his warmth, his loud, chaotic assurance that everything was going to be fine. She needed to hear him say that he would take care of her, that his money was her money. But when she arrived at Mason's penthouse, the atmosphere was not one of romance. It was an atmosphere of crisis. The living room, usually a bachelor's paradise of chrome and leather, was strewn with architectural blueprints and fast food wrappers. Mason was pacing by the window, a phone pressed to his ear, his tie undone and his hair disheveled. He looked like a man who had not slept in 48 hours. I do not care what the geotechnical report says. Mason was shouting into the phone. Pour the concrete. If we delay another week, the investors will start asking questions. Just bury the problem, O'Malley. Bury it. He ended the call and threw the phone onto the sofa, where it bounced and landed near Elise's feet. He looked at her, and for a split second, Elise saw something in his eyes that terrified her. It was not love. It was annoyance. What is it, Elise? Mason asked, rubbing his temples. I am in the middle of a war here. My card was declined, Elise said, her voice small. She hated how small she sounded. She wanted to be the powerful muse, not the dependent wife. Brandon. He cut me off. Everything. The credit lines, the joint accounts. I tried to buy you a gift, and I was humiliated. Mason let out a short, harsh laugh. Welcome to the real world, darling. Did you think he was going to keep paying your allowance after you humiliated him on live television? Elise recoiled as if he had struck her. I did that for us, Mason. I destroyed my reputation for you. And I appreciate it, Mason said, walking over to the wet bar to pour himself a drink. His hand shook slightly as he lifted the decanter. But right now, I have a 5 million pound hole in the ground at the Docklands site. The soil is unstable. The piling costs are tripling. I am bleeding cash, Elise. He turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. The charm that had seduced her, the smooth confidence of the rival tycoon, was evaporating. In its place was the desperation of a gambler on a losing streak. Speaking of cash, Mason said, his voice dropping to a lower, more calculating register. How much is left in the foundation's discretionary fund? Elise froze. Mason, we cannot touch that. We already moved $3 million last month. If the auditors look closely. The auditors will not look if we put it back before the fiscal year ends, Mason interrupted, stepping closer to her. He placed his hands on her shoulders. His grip was heavy, almost painful. I need another $2 million, Elise. Just for a month. Once the Aurora starts vertical construction, the bank releases the next tranche of funding, and I will pay it all back. With interest. Elise looked at him. She saw the sweat beading on his upper lip. She saw the fear behind the bravado. And suddenly, the image of Brandon came to her mind. Brandon, who never sweated. Brandon, who never asked her for a penny. Brandon, who built skyscrapers that could withstand earthquakes, while Mason was panic-stricken over a patch of mud. I cannot, Elise whispered. If Brandon finds out. Brandon is done. Mason shouted, his patience snapping. He is a cuckold sitting in his ivory tower. He is not looking at your accounts. He is licking his wounds. Elise, listen to me. If the Aurora fails, we fail. Do you understand? I will be bankrupt. You will be the woman who left a billionaire for a pauper. Is that what you want? The question hung in the air, ugly and brutal. Elise realized then that her romance was not a fairy tale. It was a merger, and the stock was crashing. She felt a cold knot of nausea in her stomach. She was trapped. If she refused, Mason would sink, and she would go down with him. If she agreed, she was committing a crime that could send her to prison. 1 month, Elise said, her voice trembling. You promise you will put it back in 1 month. Mason's face transformed instantly. The monster receded, and the charming lover returned. He pulled her into a hug, kissing the top of her head. I promise. You are saving us, Elise. You are the only one who believes in me. Elise closed her eyes, resting her head against his chest. But she did not feel safe. She felt the erratic thumping of his heart, fast and irregular. It felt like a ticking clock. High above the city, in the serene quiet of the Keaton spire, Brandon Keaton sat at his desk. He was not licking his wounds. He was watching a monitor. On the screen was a live feed of the financial transactions linked to the Harrington Arts Foundation. He had not cut off Elise's access to the charity accounts. That would have been too easy. He had left that door unlocked specifically because he knew they would walk through it. He watched as a pending transfer request appeared on the screen. £2 million to MD Holdings Limited. Brandon did not stop it. He did not call the police. Not yet. He simply leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled together. He was an architect, and he knew that every structure had a breaking point. He had applied the pressure, the frozen credit cards, the subtle rumors about Mason's liquidity, the sabotage of the land survey. Now, he was watching the structural integrity of their relationship fail. They were turning on each other. Mason was using Elise as a shield. Elise was compromising her morals to buy an illusion of security. Brandon reached for his phone and dialed a number. "This is Brandon Keaton," he said, his voice calm and level. "I would like to schedule a meeting with the board of directors for the Harrington Arts Foundation." "Yes, for next week. I believe it is time for an external audit. I have concerns about irregularities." He hung up the phone. Outside, the wind howled around the spire, but inside, everything was still. The trap had not just snapped shut, it had been welded closed. Elise had just signed her own confession, and Mason had handed her the pen. The evening at the Kensington auction house was an affair of suffocating elegance. Outside, the London fog curled around the gas lamps like a living thing, but inside, the air was dry, conditioned to preserve the fragility of oil paint and ancient canvas. For Elise Harrington, however, the atmosphere felt less like a sanctuary of high culture and more like an abattoir. She sat in the second row, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, the knuckles white against the dark silk of her dress. She was not here to acquire. She was here to liquidate. Mason's financial demands had become a voracious beast that could not be sated. The £2 million she had embezzled from the foundation had vanished into the muddy sinkhole of the Docklands project, swallowed by contractors and hush money, yet it was not enough. Now, she was selling her personal collection, the pieces she had acquired before her marriage, the art that she claimed was the landscape of her soul. The auctioneer, a man with a voice like polished mahogany, stepped up to the podium. "Lot 42, he announced. "The Weeping Willow" by Lucian Gray. Oil on canvas. A hush fell over the room. This was the centerpiece of the night. It was Elise's favorite painting. It depicted a solitary tree bending over a dark river, its branches trailing in the water like fingers searching for something lost. Elise had once told Brandon that this painting was the only thing in the world that understood her loneliness. Now, she was selling it to pay for concrete and steel. "Bidding starts at £300,000, the auctioneer intoned. Elise held her breath. She needed it to go for at least $500,000. Mason had promised this was the last time. Just this infusion of cash to stabilize the site, and then the aurora would rise, and they would be royalty. 350. A paddle went up near the front. 400,000, called a telephone bidder. The price was climbing. Elise felt a flicker of hope amidst the nausea. Perhaps they would survive this. Perhaps the sacrifice was worth it. She closed her eyes, praying to a God she had stopped believing in years ago. Then, the heavy oak doors at the back of the room opened. It was not a loud entrance. There was no fanfare, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Heads turned, the whispers starting like the rustle of dry leaves. Brandon Keaton walked in. He was wearing a charcoal three-piece suit that fit him with the precision of armor. He did not look at the crowd. He did not look at the art. He walked straight down the center aisle, his movement fluid and predatory, and took a seat in the front row, directly across from the auctioneer. Elise's heart hammered against her ribs. He was not supposed to be here. He hated auctions. He called them flesh markets for the inanimate. Why was he here? The auctioneer faltered for a fraction of a second, intimidated by the presence of the man who owned half the skyline, before recovering his composure. "We are at £450,000. Do I hear 460? Brandon raised his hand. He did not hold a paddle. He simply raised a single, long finger. 500,000, the auctioneer said, his voice tightening. From Mr. Keaton. Elise stared at the back of Brandon's head. He was sitting perfectly still. He was bidding on her painting, the painting she loved. A surge of confusion mixed with a strange, twisted hope rose in her chest. Was he trying to save it for her? Was this a gesture? Did he still care enough to keep her favorite possession from falling into the hands of strangers? 550, the telephone bidder countered. Brandon did not hesitate. 1 million. The room gasped. A collective intake of breath that sucked the oxygen out of the space. He had nearly doubled the bid in a single stroke. It was an aggressive, dominant move, a display of financial violence that silenced the room. The telephone bidder remained silent. No one dared to challenge the king of spires. £1 million, going once. The auctioneer stammered, sweating under the collar. Going twice. Sold to Mr. Brandon Keaton. The gavel came down with the finality of a gunshot. Elise felt tears prick her eyes. He had bought it. He had spent a fortune to keep her painting. Despite everything, the betrayal, the public humiliation, the scandal, he still wanted to preserve a piece of her. She felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of regret. Maybe she had been wrong. Maybe he wasn't cold. Maybe his love was just a language she hadn't bothered to learn. Brandon stood up. He walked to the podium where the painting sat on its easel, bathed in the warm glow of the spotlight. He looked at it for a long moment. The room was deathly silent, everyone watching the reunion between the estranged husband and the artifact of his wife's heart. Elise stood up, her legs trembling. She took a step toward him. "Brandon," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She prepared herself to thank him, perhaps even to apologize. Brandon turned. He did not look at Elise. He looked at the auctioneer. "I will take possession of the item immediately," Brandon said, his voice calm, carrying to every corner of the silent hall. "Of course, Mr. Keaton. We will have it wrapped and sent to your—" "No," Brandon interrupted. "That will not be necessary." He signaled to a waiter who was standing near the wall with a tray of refreshments. The young man approached, looking terrified. Brandon reached out and took a glass of heavy, dark red wine from the tray. Elise froze. "Brandon," she said louder this time. Brandon turned to the painting. He looked at the delicate brushstrokes of the weeping willow, the melancholic beauty that Elise had claimed defined her soul. "My wife always said this painting represented her," Brandon said, speaking to the room, though his eyes were locked on the canvas. "She said it was profound, complex, valuable." He swirled the wine in the glass. "But I have learned that provenance is everything," he continued, his voice dropping to a jagged whisper. "And when the provenance is a lie, the art is worthless." With a casual, almost bored flick of his wrist, Brandon threw the contents of the glass onto the painting. The dark red liquid splashed across the vintage canvas, soaking into the oil paint, dripping down the weeping willow like a fatal wound. It stained the river blood red. It ruined the delicate texture, destroying the value of the piece instantly. The crowd erupted in shock, a cacophony of gasps and cries. Elise screamed. It was a raw, animal sound. She rushed forward, grabbing the frame, but it was too late. The wine was already seeping into the fibers. Her million-pound lifeline, her emotional crutch, was destroyed. "Why?" she shrieked, looking up at him, her mascara running, her composure shattered. "Why would you do that? It was beautiful." Brandon looked down at her. His expression was not angry. It was not sad. It was terrifyingly empty. It was the look of a man looking at a condemned building. "It was just a transaction, Elise," he said coldly. "I bought it. It is mine. I can burn it, shred it, or drown it. That is what ownership means. You sold it to pay for your lover's mistakes. You put a price tag on your soul." He stepped closer, leaning down so only she could hear him. "Tell Mason that £1 million won't fill the hole in the Docklands. The soil is rotten, Elise. And now, you have nothing left to sell." He straightened up, adjusted his cufflinks, and turned his back on her. He walked down the center aisle, through the stunned crowd, leaving Elise kneeling on the floor, clutching the ruined, dripping canvas. She was surrounded by the elite of London, but she had never been more alone. She had sold the only thing she loved to save a man who was using her, and the husband she had called heartless had just showed her the true cost of betrayal. As Brandon exited the auction house into the cold night air, he did not look back. He took out a handkerchief, wiped a microscopic speck of red wine from his thumb, and dropped the linen into a bin. The demolition was proceeding ahead of schedule. The morning did not break. It merely seeped into the city like gray water through a cracked ceiling. London was swathed in a thick, choking fog that clung to the windows of Mason Drake's Knightsbridge apartment, turning the outside world into a shapeless, ghostly void. Inside, The air was stale, recycled, and heavy with the scent of stale coffee and impending disaster. Elise Harrington sat at the kitchen island, wrapped in a silk robe that felt too thin to protect her from the sudden chill that had taken residence in her bones. Her hands were wrapped around a mug of tea that had gone cold an hour ago. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the splash of dark red wine hitting the canvas of the weeping willow. She saw the way the liquid had run down the oil paint like a mortal wound. She heard the collective gasp of the elite, the sound of her social standing shattering on the floor of the auction house. Mason was not sitting. He was a creature of kinetic energy, pacing the length of the living room, his bare feet slapping against the hardwood floor. He was shouting into a phone, his voice hoarse, stripped of the smooth, seductive baritone that had once charmed her. He was arguing with a concrete supplier, then a banker, then a PR crisis manager. The £500,000 from the auction, money that Elise had mentally earmarked to plug the hole in the foundation, was already gone, swallowed by emergency interest payments and hush money to keeping the site inspectors at bay for another week. But the hole remained. It was a hungry mouth in the mud of the docklands, demanding more. Elise watched him, and for the first time, she saw him not as a titan of industry, but as a man frantically bailing water out of a sinking dinghy. The glamour was gone. The romance had evaporated, leaving behind the sharp, acrid taste of fear. She picked up her phone to check the time, but instead, a notification flashed across the screen. It was not a text message. It was a breaking news alert from a prominent financial investigative blog, the City Eye, known for destroying careers with a single well-placed article. The headline was simple, brutal, and terrifying. The Hollow Tower. How charity money is fueling a sinking ship. Elise's breath hitched in her throat. Her fingers, trembling uncontrollably, tapped the notification. The article loaded, and with every line she read, the room seemed to spin faster. It was all there. It was a forensic dissection of their lives. The article detailed the geological instability of Mason's Aurora project, citing a confidential survey from 10 years ago that declared the land unfit for high-rise development due to toxic industrial sludge and liquefaction risks. It exposed the fact that Mason had purchased the land for pennies on the pound, ignoring safety regulations in a desperate bid to undercut Brandon Keaton. But the text did not stop at Mason's incompetence. It went deeper. It followed the money. There were screenshots, high-resolution images of bank transfers. From the Harrington Arts Foundation to MD Holdings Ltd., Cayman Islands. The dates matched perfectly with the moments Mason's company had faced liquidity crises. The article painted a picture not of a tragic romance, but of a calculated embezzlement scheme. It described Elise not as a victim of a cold marriage, but as a willing accomplice in financial fraud, stealing from struggling artists to fund her lover's ego. Mason, Elise whispered. The sound was barely audible, but the silence in the room was so fragile that it shattered instantly. Mason stopped pacing. He looked at her, his eyes wild. What? What is it now? Look, she said, holding up the phone. Mason snatched the device from her hand. He read in silence. As his eyes scanned the screen, the color drained from his face, leaving it the color of old ash. He scrolled down, his thumb hitting the glass harder and harder. This is impossible, he muttered. These are private transfers. These are offshore accounts. Who? How did they get this? Then, he hit play on the embedded media file at the bottom of the article. The sound that filled the sleek, modern apartment was a recording. It was grainy, but the voices were unmistakable. It was the conversation from the gallery, 2 years ago. I did not do it for your neck. I did it because I am bored, Mason. I hate touching him. He feels like marble. It was Elise's voice. Naked, cruel, dismissive. Then Mason's voice, dripping with arrogance. He is useful, though. We cannot kill the golden goose just yet. Elise covered her mouth with her hand, a wave of nausea crashing over her. Hearing her own words played back was like standing in front of a mirror that showed the ugliness of her soul. It sounded different back then, in the heat of the affair, in the thrill of the secret. Back then, it had felt like rebellion. Now, echoed through the tiny speakers of a smartphone, It sounded cheap. It sounded malicious. It sounded like the plotting of two parasites. Mason threw the phone onto the sofa as if it had burned him. "Brandon," he hissed. It was him. "He has been recording us." He knew. He knew the whole time. "He knew?" Elise repeated, her voice rising to a shrill pitch. "If he knew, why didn't he stop us? Why didn't he scream? Why did he let me? Why did he let me steal?" "Because he wanted you to hang yourself," Mason roared, turning on her. "Don't you get it? He fed us the rope. He waited until the transfer was made, until the crime was committed, until the money was in my account. He isn't just divorcing you, Elise. He is sending you to prison." The word hung in the air. Prison. Elise stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She backed away from him. "You said it was a loan, Mason. You said we would pay it back before anyone noticed." "I can't pay it back," Mason screamed, kicking a heavy leather ottoman across the room. "The project is dead. The article says the land is toxic. No bank will touch me now. The investors will pull out by noon. It's over. It is all over." He collapsed onto the sofa, burying his face in his hands. The strong, invincible protector she had left her husband for was gone. In his place was a weeping, broken man who looked small and pathetic. Elise looked at the window. The fog outside was swirling, pressing against the glass. Her phone began to ring. Then Mason's phone. Then the landline. A cacophony of noise erupted in the silent apartment. It was the press. It was the lawyers. It was the police. She walked to the window and looked down. Through the mist, she could see the flashing blue lights of police cars gathering at the entrance of the building. They were silent from this height, like toys, but their purpose was clear. They were not here for a noise complaint. They were here for the directors of the Harrington Arts Foundation. A sudden, horrifying clarity washed over her. Brandon hadn't just destroyed her reputation, he had dismantled her reality. He had watched her lie, watched her cheat, watched her steal, and he had simply gathered the evidence, piece by piece, filing it away in his pristine, orderly mind. He had treated her betrayal like a structural flaw in a building, something to be analyzed, isolated, and then subjected to a controlled demolition. "We have to leave," Elise said, her voice trembling. "Mason, we have to go? Now." Mason looked up. His eyes were red-rimmed and empty. "Go where, Elise? My accounts are frozen. Your passport is probably flagged by now. There is nowhere to go." He laughed, a dry, rattling sound. "He didn't even have to fight us. He just handed us the shovels and watched us dig." The buzzer from the lobby rang, a harsh, insistent buzz that sounded like a judgment. Elise backed into the corner of the room, wrapping her arms around herself. She thought of the penthouse at the Keaton Spire. She thought of the silence there, the safety, the cold but unbreakable strength of her husband. She realized now that the coldness wasn't an absence of feeling, it was a shield she had foolishly stepped out from behind. She looked at Mason, who was now pouring a drink with shaking hands at 10 in the morning, and felt nothing but revulsion. The love she thought was a blazing fire was just a smoke bomb, and now the smoke had cleared, leaving only ash and the ruin of two lives. The elevator chimed in the hallway. Heavy footsteps approached the door. A sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the apartment. "Police, open the door." Elise Harrington closed her eyes and let the first real tear fall. Not a tear for the cameras, not a tear for sympathy, but a tear of absolute, crushing regret. The leak had become a flood, and she was drowning. The digital town square had transformed into a medieval pillory overnight. The audio file, leaked by the anonymous investigative blog, was short, barely 30 seconds of compressed data, yet it possessed the destructive yield of a tactical nuclear weapon. It played on loop on every news channel, every radio station, and every smartphone screen in London. The voice of Elise Harrington, once described by society columnists as honey poured over velvet, was now ringing in the ears of millions, but the honey had turned to vinegar. Her cruel laughter, recorded in the gallery 2 years prior, stripped away the carefully curated veneer of the victimized wife and revealed the cold, calculating opportunist beneath. The reaction from the public was not merely a shift in opinion, it was a violent recoil. The same masses who had, only days ago, wept for the beautiful woman trapped in a golden cage, now felt the stinging humiliation of having been duped. There is no wrath greater than that of a crowd which realizes its empathy has been weaponized against it. The narrative of the cold architect and the lonely muse had been inverted. Brandon Keaton was no longer the villain of the piece. He was the stoic martyr, the man who had built an empire while his wife was busy tunneling under the foundations to steal the silver. Inside the temporary sanctuary of a serviced apartment in Kensington, Mason's Knightsbridge penthouse having been besieged by paparazzi, Elise Harrington sat in the dark. She held a tablet in her lap, her face illuminated by the harsh blue light of the screen. She knew she should not look. Her lawyers had advised her, in stern and panicked tones, to disconnect from all media. But human nature is a moth drawn to the flame that burns it. She scrolled through the comments on her Instagram page, which had transformed from a shrine of adoration into a wall of graffiti. Thief. You deserve prison. He loved you, and you laughed at him. Fake. Everything about you is fake. The hashtag Team Elise, which had trended globally just 48 hours ago, had vanished, replaced by hashtag Justice for Brandon and hashtag Golddigger. The vitriol was visceral. People were not just attacking her actions. They were dissecting her character, her appearance, her soul. They analyzed photos of her wearing the diamond necklace at the gala, calculating how many struggling artists could have been funded with the money she had siphoned into Mason's offshore accounts. The hypocrisy was the sin they could not forgive. She had stood on a stage and preached about emotional neglect while she was committing financial fraud. Elise looked across the room. Mason Drake was slumped in an armchair, staring blankly at the television. The news was showing aerial footage of the construction site at the Docklands. Work had stopped completely. The police had cordoned off the area, designating it a crime scene pending the investigation into the embezzlement. Mason looked smaller than Elise had ever seen him. The bravado, the loud suits, the expensive cologne, it all seemed like a costume that no longer fit. He was not a titan. He was just a desperate man who had gambled with money that was not his and lost. Turn it off, Elise said, her voice raspy from lack of sleep. Mason did not move. They are interviewing the foreman, he mumbled. O'Malley. He is talking. He is telling them I knew about the soil. He is telling them everything. Turn it off, Elise screamed, picking up a heavy crystal coaster and hurling it at the wall. It shattered, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the small room. Mason flinched, finally looking at her. His eyes were full of accusation. This is your fault, he spat. If you had not made that speech, if you had just left him quietly, none of this would have happened. You had to have the spotlight. You had to humiliate him. My fault. Elise stood up, shaking with rage. I did what you told me to do. You said we needed to destroy his reputation to hurt his stock price. You said it was the only way the Aurora could compete. I destroyed my marriage for your building, Mason, and now your building is nothing but a hole in the mud. At least I built something. Mason countered, standing up to face her. What did you ever do, Elise? You curated art other people painted. You spent money other people earned. You are a parasite. And now, the host has cut you off. The words hit her with the force of a physical blow because they echoed the very comments she had been reading online. She backed away from him, retreating into the bedroom and locking the door. She slid down against the wood, pulling her knees to her chest. She wanted to call someone, a friend, an ally. But as she scrolled through her contacts, she realized with a dawning horror that she had no one. Her friends were fair-weather socialites who valued proximity to power above all else. They were currently scrubbing their social media feeds of any photos with her. She was radioactive. Meanwhile, across the city, the atmosphere at the headquarters of Keaton Industries was one of quiet, disciplined triumph. The stock price, which had dipped initially, had not just recovered. It had soared to an all-time high. The public, now viewing Brandon as a brilliant man who had maintained his dignity in the face of betrayal, was buying into his vision with renewed fervor. Investors saw his silence not as weakness, but as the ultimate display of control. If a man could remain focused while his personal life was being incinerated, he could certainly steer a company through a recession. Brandon Keaton sat in his office, overlooking the city. He was not reading the comments. He did not need the validation of the mob. He was reviewing a report from his legal team. The forensic audit of the Harrington Arts Foundation was complete. The evidence was irrefutable. Elise had authorized 19 separate transfers to shell companies linked to Mason Drake. It was grand larceny. It was fraud. It was enough to ensure that she would not only leave the marriage with nothing, but she might very well trade the penthouse for a prison cell. His assistant, a young woman named Sarah, knocked softly on the glass door. "Mr. Keaton? There is a crowd gathering outside the tower." Brandon did not turn his chair. "Protesters?" "No, sir," Sarah said, her voice tinged with awe. "Supporters. They are leaving flowers. And notes. Apologizing." Brandon closed his eyes for a brief moment. He felt no joy in this. He felt no satisfaction in their pity. The public was a fickle beast. It loved to build idols just as much as it loved to destroy them. He did not want their flowers. He wanted the one thing that money could not buy and that Elise had stolen from him: the truth. "Have security clear the entrance," Brandon said coldly. "We are a place of business, not a shrine." "And Sarah? Send the file to the district attorney. The final version." "Yes, sir." Back in the service department, Elise felt the walls closing in. She could not stay here with Mason. The air between them was toxic. She needed to breathe. She needed to go to the only place that still felt like hers, the Harrington Gallery. Perhaps there, surrounded by beauty, she could think. Perhaps she could salvage something. She disguised herself as best she could: a trench coat, a scarf wrapped around her head, large sunglasses. She slipped out the back exit, avoiding the main press pack, and hailed a black cab. The ride to Mayfair was surreal. The city looked the same, yet it felt completely hostile. Every person walking on the street looked like a potential judge. When the cab pulled up in front of the gallery, Elise's heart stopped. The windows were not smashed, but they might as well have been. The pristine white facade of the gallery, which she had maintained with obsessive care, was defaced. Someone had taken red paint, mimicking the wine Brandon had thrown, and splattered it across the glass. Written in jagged, angry letters across the door was a single word: counterfeit. Elise stepped out of the cab, her legs trembling. A passerby, a woman walking a poodle, stopped and stared at her. The woman squinted, then her eyes went wide. Recognition. "That is her," the woman said loudly. "That is the wife." People turned. Heads snapped around. Phones were raised like weapons. "Shame on you," a man shouted from across the street. "Where is the money, Elise?" another voice called out. Elise fumbled for her keys, her hands shaking so violently she dropped them. The sound of the metal hitting the pavement was swallowed by the rising murmur of the crowd. They were closing in, not to attack her physically, but to suffocate her with their judgment. She was exposed. The scarf could not hide her. The sunglasses could not shield her. She abandoned the keys. She turned and ran. She ran down the street, her heels clicking frantically on the pavement, fleeing from the gallery that bore her maiden name, fleeing from the legacy she had destroyed. She ran until her lungs burned, until she found herself in a small park, collapsing onto a bench under the gray, weeping sky. She was alone. Truly, utterly alone. Mason was a sinking ship. The public was a pack of wolves. And Brandon was the mountain she had tried to move, only to have it crush her. In that moment of absolute desolation, a realization crystallized in her mind. There was only one person who could stop this. There was only one person who had the power to call off the dogs, to silence the noise, to grant her a shred of mercy. She had to see him. She had to look him in the eye, not the cameras, not the lawyers, but him. She pulled out her phone. She did not call Mason. She dialed the private line of the executive office at the Keaton Spire. "Keaton Industries," Sarah's voice answered, professional and cool. "I need to see him," Elise whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, tell him. Tell him I am coming to the tower. Tell him I am ready to sign anything." The silence on the other end lasted for a long, agonizing second. "Mr. Keaton is expecting you, Miss Harrington," Sarah replied. Elise lowered the phone. The game was over. It was time to face the architect. The elevator ride to the 100th floor of the Keaton Spire was a journey through a vacuum of silence. For Elise Harrington, the sensation of rising so rapidly was nauseating, a physical inversion of the precipitous fall her life had taken in the last 48 hours. She stood alone in the glass capsule, watching the gray, rain-lashed city of London shrink beneath her feet. Her reflection in the elevator doors was a stranger to her. Her hair was damp and plastered to her cheeks. Her trench coat was stained with the mud of the street, and her eyes were wide, rimmed with red, darting around like a trapped animal. She had arrived at the tower not as the mistress of the house, but as a petitioner, cleared by security only after a humiliating 10-minute wait in the lobby where the staff, who once bowed to her, now averted their gaze. The doors slid open with a soft, pneumatic hiss. The penthouse was exactly as she remembered it, vast, cold, and terrifyingly perfect. The floor-to-ceiling windows offered a panoramic view of the storm, turning the room into an observatory at the edge of the world. The only light came from the city below and the faint, clinical glow of the architectural lamps on the drafting table. Brandon was there. He stood by the northern window, his silhouette cut sharply against the backdrop of the darkened sky. He was not looking at her. He was looking out at the city he had helped build, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. He wore a crisp white shirt, the sleeves rolled up to his elbows with precise symmetry, and dark trousers. He looked immaculate. He looked untouched. While Elise had been running through the mud, dodging cameras and insults, Brandon had been up here, breathing the rarefied air of the gods. Elise took a step forward, the sound of her wet heels on the marble floor echoing like a gunshot in a cathedral. She shivered, the chill of the room seeping into her damp clothes. "Brandon," she whispered. Her voice was a broken instrument, raspy and thin. He did not turn. "You are wet, Elise. You are dripping on the limestone." His voice was calm, devoid of anger, devoid of warmth. It was a statement of fact, an observation of a flaw in his environment. "I had nowhere else to go," she said, her voice rising with a desperate edge. "They are everywhere. The press, the police. They are at the apartment. They are at the gallery. Mason is finished, Brandon. He is bankrupt. He lied to me." "He did not lie to you about the money, Elise," Brandon said, finally turning to face her. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes observing her with the detached curiosity of a scientist examining a specimen under a microscope. "He asked for it, and you gave it to him. You signed the transfers. You authorized the theft." "I did it for love," Elise cried, walking toward him, her hands reaching out as if to grasp the ghost of the man she had married. "I was confused. I felt abandoned. You were always working, always cold, always building these tombs. Mason made me feel alive. He manipulated me, Brandon. I see that now. I was a victim too." Brandon watched her approach. He did not step back, but his stillness was a barrier more impenetrable than any wall. When she was close enough to touch him, he simply looked at her hand until she dropped it, defeated. "A victim," Brandon repeated slowly, testing the weight of the word. "That is a convenient narrative. It is the one you used on stage at the gala. It is the one you used in the press. But we are not on a stage anymore, Elise. There are no cameras here. So let us have the one thing you never gave me in 5 years, the truth." He walked over to his desk and picked up a remote control. He pressed a button, and the large monitor on the wall flickered to life. It showed a live news feed. Aerial footage showed police cars surrounding a construction site in the Docklands, Mason's site. Other cameras showed Mason Drake being led out of his Knightsbridge apartment in handcuffs, his head bowed, his jacket pulled over his face to hide from the flashbulbs. "Mason is being arrested for fraud, embezzlement, and gross negligence," Brandon said, his voice flat. "The authorities have the files. They have the emails between you two. They know it was not just a romance. It was a conspiracy." Elise stared at the screen, horror washing over her. "I will go to jail," she whispered, the reality crashing down on her. "Brandon, please. You can stop this. You have the best lawyers in London. You can tell them. Tell them I was coerced. Tell them I did not know." She fell to her knees. It was not a calculated move this time. Her legs simply gave out. She knelt on the cold marble, looking up at him, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. I am your wife. We were happy once. Remember Paris? Remember the day you bought the gallery for me? Please, Brandon, do not let them take me. I will do anything. I will sign anything. Just save me. Brandon looked down at her. For a fleeting second, a shadow of something that might have been pain crossed his eyes, but it vanished as quickly as it had appeared, replaced by the steel of his resolve. I did buy you the gallery, Brandon said softly. I bought you the life you wanted. I gave you the platform, the status, the freedom, and you used it to fund a man who builds on quicksand. He crouched down, not to comfort her, but to look her in the eye. You say I was cold. You say I was a ghost. But Elise, I loved you. I loved you with the quiet, structural certainty of a foundation. I did not need to shout it. I held you up. I supported every dream you had. But you did not want a foundation. You wanted a mirror. What? She sobbed, confused. You wanted someone to reflect your own vanity back at you. Brandon continued, his voice dropping to a whisper that cut through her like a blade. Mason did that. He told you were a genius. He told you were the victim. He played to your ego. I just loved you. And that was too boring for you. That was too cold. He stood up and walked to his desk. He picked up a thick document and a fountain pen, the same Mont Blanc pen he used to sign billion-pound contracts. He walked back and placed them on the floor in front of her. This is the divorce settlement, Brandon said. And a confession. Elise looked at the papers through her blurred vision. Confession. It is a statement admitting your role in the embezzlement, but characterizing it as a result of emotional manipulation under duress, Brandon explained. If you sign this, and if you sign away all claims to the Keaton estate, my legal team will submit it to the district attorney. They will argue for leniency. You will avoid prison. You will likely get probation and a heavy fine, which I will pay. Hope surged in Elise's chest. He was saving her. After everything, he was saving her. Oh, thank you, she gasped, reaching for the pen. Thank you, Brandon. I knew you still loved me. I knew it. Do not mistake mercy for affection, Brandon interrupted, his voice sharp enough to stop her hand in midair. I am not doing this because I love you. I am doing this because I do not want the name Keaton dragged through a criminal trial for the next 2 years. I am cleaning up the site. I am removing the debris. The words hung in the air, brutal and final. Debris. That was what she was to him now. Rubble to be cleared away so he could build again. Elise gripped the pen. Her hand shook violently. She looked at the man she had lived with for 5 years, the man she had ridiculed, the man she had betrayed. She realized then that she had never really seen him. She had mistaken his silence for emptiness, when in reality, it was depth. And now, staring into that depth, she saw that she had not just lost a fortune. She had lost the only person who had ever truly seen her value. And she had traded him for a man who was currently sitting in the back of a police van. And after I sign, she asked, her voice trembling, what happens to us? Brandon turned back to the window, looking out at the rain that was finally beginning to slow, revealing the glittering lights of the city below. There is no us, Elise, he said. Once you sign that paper, you leave. You leave London. You leave the gallery. You leave my life. You become a stranger. If I see you on the street, I will not know you. He paused, and for the first time, his shoulders relaxed, as if a great weight was being lifted. Sign it, he commanded. The elevator is waiting. Elise bent over the paper. The ink flowed black and permanent onto the white page, marking the end of Elise Keaton and the return of Elise Harrington, a woman with no money, no reputation, and no home. She signed her name. It looked small on the page. She stood up, leaving the documents on the floor. She waited for him to say something else, to look at her one last time. But Brandon Keaton remained facing the window, a solitary figure standing watch over his city. He had inspected the damage, he had reinforced the structure, and now, he was simply waiting for the dust to settle. Elise turned and walked toward the elevator. The doors opened, and she stepped into the box. As the doors slid shut, cutting off her view of the penthouse, she saw Brandon's reflection in the glass one last time. He did not wave. He did not move. He was a statue of ice, and she was the one who was finally freezing. London possesses a unique capacity for amnesia, a city where the fog not only obscures the skyline, but seems to erase the scandals of the past with the turning of the seasons. 6 months had passed since the night the red wine stained the canvas at the Kensington auction house, and the spring air was now crisp and indifferent, carrying the scent of blooming cherry blossoms rather than the acrid tang of ruin. The tabloids, those voracious beasts that had feasted on the carcass of the Keaton-Harrington marriage, had long since moved on to fresher prey, a royal gaffe or a pop star's breakdown. The crater in the Docklands, once the site of Mason Drake's ambition, remained a scar on the riverbank, but the city had already begun to grow around it, ignoring the whole much like a body ignores an old, faded scar. Mason Drake was no longer a headline. He was a statistic. The trial had been swift, brutal, and devoid of the glamour he had so desperately craved. There were no flashing cameras at his sentencing, only the scratch of a court stenographer's pen and the stern, bored voice of a judge who had seen 1,000 men like him, men who mistook leverage for genius. He had been sentenced to 6 years in a minimum security facility for fraud and embezzlement. The Aurora project was liquidated, its assets sold for scrap to pay off the creditors. Mason had gone into the courtroom shouting about conspiracies and vendettas, but he had walked out in silence, a man finally crushed by the weight of the concrete reality he had tried to cheat. For Elise Harrington, the end came not with a bang, but with a quiet, suffocating whimper. She stood in the departure hall of St. Pancras International Station, the high glass ceiling arching above her like the ribcage of a leviathan. She held a single ticket to Paris in her hand. It was a one-way ticket. There was no entourage to carry her luggage, no chauffeur waiting outside in a Bentley, no paparazzi lurking behind the pillars hoping for a glimpse of her grief. She was invisible. She wore a simple beige coat that she had bought off the rack, and her hair, once highlighted to a perfect honey blonde by the most expensive stylists in Mayfair, was now pulled back in a severe, practical bun. She sat on a wooden bench, watching the digital display board click through the departures. She had avoided prison, thanks to the confession Brandon had orchestrated, but the price of her freedom was her identity. The settlement had stripped her of the Keaton name and the assets associated with it. She was Elise Harrington again, but without the gallery, without the reputation, and without the social circle that had defined her existence. She was returning to the continent to live with a distant aunt and lion, to perhaps teach art history to children who would never know she had once held the attention of all London. Her gaze drifted to a newsstand nearby. Her breath hitched. There, on the cover of Architectural Digest, was a face she knew better than her own. Brandon. He looked different in the photograph. The severe, marble-like tension that had defined his features for the last few years of their marriage was gone. He was wearing a casual black turtleneck, standing on a suspended steel beam, windblown and commanding. He looked not just powerful, but vital. The headline read, "The Rebuilder, How Brandon Keaton is Turning Ruin into Renewal." Elise walked over to the stand, her fingers trembling as she reached out to touch the glossy paper. She did not buy the magazine. She could not justify the expense, but she read the byline. It detailed Brandon's acquisition of the failed Aurora site. He was not building a new tower to feed his ego. He was turning the toxic, unstable land into a public green space and a sustainable low-income housing project, stabilized by a revolutionary engineering technique he had patented. He was fixing Mason's mistake. He was healing the ground. A tear leaked from the corner of her eye, hot and stinging. She realized then the true magnitude of her loss. She had left a man who could turn mud into gardens for a man who turned gold into dust. She had called Brandon cold, but she had been the one shivering in the dark, unable to recognize the warmth of a slow-burning fire. Final boarding call for Eurostar Service 9054 to Paris Gare du Nord. The announcer's voice echoed through the station. Elise pulled her hand back from the magazine. She picked up her suitcase, the wheels rattling on the floor. She walked toward the gate, passing through the barriers, stepping out of London and out of the story she had tried so hard to write. As the train pulled away, sliding into the darkness of the tunnel, she saw her reflection in the window, a ghost fading into the black, leaving no trace behind. Across the city, high above the noise of the traffic, the air in the penthouse of the Keaton Spire was different. The silence was still there, but it was no longer heavy. It was the peaceful, contemplative silence of a sanctuary. The drafting table was covered in new sketches, the lines bold and fluid. Brandon Keaton stood by the window, the same spot where he had watched his marriage dissolve 6 months ago. The rain had stopped long ago. The sky was a brilliant, piercing blue, the kind of clear spring day that made the glass of the skyscrapers sing with light. He held a fountain pen in his hand, the same Mont Blanc, but filled with fresh ink. On the desk lay the final deed of transfer for the Docklands site. It was the last piece of paperwork. The Aurora was officially dead. The Keaton Gardens were born. He looked down at the paper. He thought of Mason, sitting in a cell, blaming the world. He thought of Elise, likely on a train, fleeing the wreckage. He felt no triumph. The feeling of revenge, which he had assumed would be sweet, was actually quite tasteless. It was merely a necessary demolition, a clearing of the site. What he felt now, looking at the signature line, was something far more profound: relief. He had spent 5 years trying to be the husband Elise wanted, trying to soften his edges, trying to buy her happiness with galleries and jewelry, all while knowing deep down that the foundation was cracked. He had lived in anxiety, waiting for the collapse. Now, the collapse had happened. The dust had settled, and he was still standing. He signed his name, Brandon Keaton. The signature was firm, unwavering, and underlined to a chapter closed. The elevator chimed. Brandon turned. It was not a lawyer or a PR agent or a ghost from the past. It was Sarah, his assistant, holding a tablet and a coffee. But she was not alone. Standing next to her was a woman Brandon had met recently, Dr. Elena Vance, a landscape architect he had hired to consult on the gardens. She had messy hair, dirt under her fingernails, and a laugh that sounded like a cello. She didn't care about his money. She cared about soil pH levels and root systems. "We have the soil samples for the North Quadrant, Brandon," Elena said, walking into the room without waiting for permission, her energy bright and infectious. "You were right. The bedrock is deeper than we thought, but I think if we use willow trees, their roots can help stabilize the bank naturally." "Willow trees," Brandon repeated, a faint, genuine smile touching his lips. The irony was not lost on him. Elise had sold a painting of a weeping willow to betray him. Now, real willows would help him rebuild. "Yes, willows," Elena said, spreading a map on his desk, covering the legal documents without a second thought. "They are resilient. They bend, they don't break, and they drink up all the sorrow in the ground." Brandon looked at her, then out at the city. He looked at the horizon, which was no longer limited by the storm clouds of his past. He realized he was no longer just an architect of buildings. He was the architect of his own peace. "Let us plant them, then," Brandon said, his voice warm, resonating in the light-filled room. "Let us plant a forest." He turned his back on the window, leaving the view of the city behind to focus on the plans spread out before him. The billionaire who had been publicly humiliated was gone. In his place was a man who understood that the most important structure he would ever build was a life that could not be shaken. In the end, Brandon didn't just defeat his enemies. He healed himself. By planting willow trees where a toxic tower once stood, he showed us that our past traumas don't have to define our future. We all have debris in our lives, betrayals, failures, heartbreaks. But like a great architect, we have the power to clear the site and build something beautiful and new. Never let a bad chapter be the end of your story. If this message resonated with you, share this video with someone who needs a reminder of their own strength. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. And I have a question for you. What country are you tuning in from right now? Represent your flag in the comments section. Thank you for watching, and keep building your own masterpiece.